Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and today our author's take on video covers the biggest craze in modern storytelling: shared universes. It sure seems like shared universes are everywhere, doesn't it? Especially in the movies. Ever since Marvel proved it could be done on film, every studio's trying to get one. We of course have shared universes in comics, you occasionally see them in novels. Shared universes are all over the place, and personally, I love them. I'm working on one myself with my own original works. Shared universes are a really neat concept. The idea that all these different characters and different stories that you like actually coexist. They're not part of separate, unrelated stories, but they're all one story, or they're all one world filled with stories. It helps make fiction, in a way, feel more real. Like, you're not just stepping in to see this one event take place in a world you're never going to revisit. This is one event of many events in an expansive world where anything can happen. Well, anything within the rules set, depending on how extravagant you want to go. Combine that with the thrill of seeing characters you really like interact with each other, and seeing how they bounce off each other, and having it actually be official and not just a what if you and your friends come up with. That's something really cool. That's something that always just sort of sparks interest, at least in me. I mean, why wouldn't it? Sure, we can enjoy character A and character B on their own, but seeing them get together every once in a while, that's just something special. That's an event, a real genuine event. I have absolutely no problem with shared universes at all, at least not in theory. I think that they are something which should be pursued. You don't need to pursue them, obviously. You want to tell just a single story focused on a single group of characters in a very specific world that's self-contained. There is nothing wrong with that at all. That's what most people do. It's what sustained storytelling for eons by this point. So, you know what? That's not a problem. But shared universes really are cool, and if you want to make one of those, that's just as interesting. You don't have to, like I said, but if you want to, it's a really cool idea. Now, for as much as I've been saying that shared universes are cool by this point, and I'm pretty sure I've said it quite a bit, that doesn't mean that they automatically work every time. I mean, we've seen plenty of examples of shared universes that tried following in the MCU's footsteps and just did not quite get there. Or it took them a while to reach a point where they actually were accepted, if they actually made it that far. Now, I've seen plenty of people talk about the whole why Marvel works and DC doesn't, or whatever you choose to compare it to. And it always comes down to certain things involving how the characters are portrayed, when they choose to do specific storylines and things like that. And all that advice is good advice, sure. It's legitimate critique a lot of the time. Well, sometimes. But I think there's one aspect which I haven't come across yet in any of these video essays or articulations, which I think really speaks to the idea of why particular shared universes don't work. Like I said, I love shared universes, and I encourage people to do them if they want to. But if you're gonna make a shared universe, here's the most important advice I think you can ever get. Don't get so caught up in the universe that you forget to tell a story. What I mean by that is, even if you're creating a vast network of stories that interlock and affect each other and can potentially cross over with each other, you don't want that to be such a focus that your story itself is not self-contained. That, I think, is the primary thing that tends to be an issue with shared universes that don't work. It can even be an issue with shared universes that do work. You see, audiences generally want a story that is self-contained. Even those of us who like shared universes and interconnectivity and continuity, we still want to watch a movie or read a book or something and have the specific experience be its own experience. We don't necessarily want to have to do homework, basically. To give you a good idea of what I'm talking about, actually, the Marvel Cinematic Universe itself provides examples of how to do it right and how to do it wrong. Kind of interestingly, although I guess since it's been running for over a decade by this point, that sort of thing was inevitable. When you go back to Phase 1 of the MCU, every single movie from that period is self-contained. The one exception is Iron Man 2, although it's a sequel. The 2 in the title gives that away, so it's kind of implied you gotta watch the first Iron Man in order to get it. But otherwise, every single entry is a self-contained film. You can watch Thor on its own. You can watch Captain America the First Avenger on its own. You can watch the first Iron Man on its own. You can watch The Incredible Hulk and wonder why you bothered watching The Incredible Hulk. But even so, you can take any one of those films, watch it individually, and then go straight to the Avengers if you wanted to. In fact, even that first Avengers movie was designed to be self-contained. Even though it's technically a sequel to several different series that were started simultaneously, it too is self-contained. You may have occasionally seen recent critiques of that movie popping up as of late, criticizing it for having a bit of heavy exposition at the beginning of the film. Which it does. I'm not going to say that it doesn't. But that exposition does not exist without purpose. You see, the first Avengers movie is not acting on the assumption that you've seen every single movie leading up to it. Maybe you've only seen one of those movies. Maybe you only watched the 2 Iron Man films and are jumping right into the Avengers. Heck, maybe you're just starting with the Avengers and you didn't see anything that came before it. Whatever the case, the first act of that film is designed to quickly reintroduce you to the characters. It gives you the basics of who they are and what motivates them while still keeping the plot going, so that if you didn't see certain movies or any of the movies prior to it, you're not lost. You're caught up, you know who's who, you know what they're doing, you know what's going on. You can watch The Avengers entirely on its own. However, as the MCU progressed, being self-contained started to become less of a priority, to the point where now I honestly don't think it even exists at all within the movies. Let's say hypothetically you're someone who didn't follow the MCU for pretty much all of it, but then Spider-Man Homecoming came along. Spider-Man is a mainstream character. Everybody loves Spider-Man. Everyone's experienced Spider-Man in some form. I mean, certainly more so than anyone had experienced Guardians of the Galaxy before they got their movie. So, you see that Spider-Man Homecoming is coming along, and it's yet another reboot, but you like Spider-Man, so you want to check that movie out. If you just start with Spider-Man Homecoming and you haven't seen any of the MCU films prior to it, you will be lost, because it is assuming that you've seen the other films. In order to know where Spider-Man came from and why he has a connection with Tony Stark, you gotta watch Captain America Civil War first. Except you can't really watch Captain America Civil War on its own, because that's like the third Captain America movie and the second and a half Avengers movie. So prior to that, you gotta watch Ant-Man and Avengers Age of Ultron, but you can't just watch those as your starting point either. You gotta go back, watch the other Captain America movies. You probably should go back and watch the very first Avengers movie, because Homecoming begins literally after the Avengers ends. And then, well, you know what? You should probably watch the Iron Man movies as well, because you should know Tony Stark's character arc and why he's acting that way towards Peter Parker. Yeah, you gotta watch a lot in order to understand this one movie. I suppose you don't have to, of course. You could just watch Homecoming on its own and wonder what the big alien monster is, or why Tony Stark is acting the way he is, and what that comment about his father means, and what Peter Parker was making those little iPhone vlog movies about at the beginning. You know what? Forget all of that. You are better off not being confused and just going back to the beginning. And frankly, I don't think that's good storytelling. It's ridiculous to expect your audience to watch a whole bunch of other movies just so they can understand one movie that's supposed to be the start of a completely new series. That's kind of an unrealistic expectation. Not to mention, it prevents Spider-Man Homecoming from being a self-contained story. Every major plot point that happens in that film started in a different film. So what you're watching isn't really a self-contained story, it's a sequel to a bunch of other movies that really weren't connected to it in the first place. It's not really the start of anything. It's an Avengers side story for all intents and purposes. And Homecoming isn't the only film with that issue. I could have just said practically the exact same thing had I selected Black Panther instead. But lest you think I'm jumping on some sort of anti-Marvel bandwagon, remember, I said that they started off doing it in a good, self-contained way, and it took them a while to get to the point I was just talking about. You can't say the same for other attempts at shared universes. Consider the failed experiment of the Dark Universe, which begins and ends with the 2017 reboot of The Mummy. That film is filled with all sorts of Easter eggs and setup for other Universal monster movies. They set up Frankenstein, they set up Dracula, they set up the creature from the Black Lagoon, they have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as a principal character, though he doesn't really do all that much, all things considered. By the time it actually stops being about establishing the Dark Universe and remembers that there's a mummy we have to deal with, the story it winds up telling was told better when it was done in 1999 and Brendan Fraser was the star. That movie shouldn't have really been called The Mummy, it should have been called The Dark Universe featuring the Mummy. And even then, the Mummy herself was an afterthought. And that's, I think, part of why people were so turned off to it. It didn't feel like they were watching a self-contained horror action movie. It felt like they were watching a trailer for a whole bunch of other movies that we're never gonna get now. Similar deal with the recent Hellboy reboot. Among the many, many problems with that movie is that it was trying to establish that shared universe. It brought in characters for no reason other than to establish they exist, but you'll see more of them in their own solo films, and it even ends by introducing a character, well, starting to introduce a character who is central to the whole mythos, but again, it cuts off right when they introduce him because they're saving that for a different movie. But of course, we're never going to get that now either. Don't even get me started on the Cloverfield paradox, which tried to take a bunch of movies that were not connected to each other outside of having one shared word in the title and trying to force them together when they really couldn't be forced together, and, surprise, surprise, didn't wind up working. Now, if you hop over from Marvel to DC, the DCEU also commonly gets critiqued for this sort of thing, but I think when you look at it objectively, you'll see it's more evenly split in terms of standalone versus building off of everything else. It would be accurate to say that Man of Steel, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, and Justice League form somewhat of a trilogy. They clearly build on each other, themes carry over between those different films. That's a series of films that you kind of need to watch in order. Wonder Woman, on the other hand, outside of that framing device with Bruce Wayne sending that photograph to Diana, Wonder Woman is self-contained. You don't need to have seen Batman v Superman first. Even though that's where we first meet this version of Wonder Woman, you could watch Wonder Woman completely on its own. Suicide Squad is kind of sort of a mix in that regard. There's definitely stuff that only makes sense if you've seen Batman v Superman, but it does still try to tell a fairly self-contained story. And of course, post-Justice League, Aquaman and Shazam are completely self-contained. You don't need to have seen the other films prior to that. For all that it matters, Aquaman could potentially be your first film. They make, one reference to the events of Justice League, and otherwise 100% self-contained. Well, I guess with that one reference, it's 99.9% self-contained, but that's still pretty good. Then, of course, you have the MonsterVerse, and admittedly, it's hard to judge it at this point because, well, there are only 3 movies as of this video's recording. The 4th movie, Godzilla vs. Kong, as of this video, has yet to be released. We haven't even gotten the trailer yet. But based on what we've seen so far, they are also fairly self-contained. Now, Godzilla 2014, of course, was made before the MonsterVerse was even established as a thing. It was, by its very nature, designed to be completely self-contained. Kong Skull Island also was developed prior to the MonsterVerse existing, so references to outside things, generally, they're minimum. Like, Monarch exists in both of them, but that's like S.H.I.E.L.D. existing in Phase 1 of the MCU. You know what that organization is based entirely on what happens within the movies. And the realization that Godzilla and other monsters exist beyond this film is saved for the very, very end. So, if you didn't stick around for the post-credits stinger, and you missed that scene, you don't necessarily lose anything. So, Kong Skull Island is also fairly self-contained. Godzilla King of the Monsters is slightly less self-contained because it is a sequel to Godzilla 2014, and it's making references to Kong throughout. But otherwise, again, you can pretty much watch it as its own experience. The story, for the most part, just requires you to know that Godzilla has attacked at some point in the past, and there are other monsters out there. You get a better sense of those details if you've seen the other movies, but you can probably watch King of the Monsters on its own as well. In fact, Michael Dougherty basically said that the connective parts that established the shared universe aspect were more like breadcrumbs. And that's completely true. They mention Kong, they mention Skull Island in King of the Monsters, but they're not vital to the events. It's not like you won't know anything that's going on if you don't know what Kong Skull Island is about. You can watch the movie and think, oh, there's King Kong, what do you know? And otherwise, the story is contained to within that runtime. It's self-contained, like I've been saying. And heck, if you want examples that have nothing to do with movies, look at stuff like the Cthulhu mythos and the Adventures of Conan the Barbarian. That's one of the older examples of a shared universe from literature. H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard were friends and collaborators, and they rather frequently used elements from each other's work in their stories. The Cthulhu mythos and the Adventures of Conan the Barbarian are officially the same universe. But yet again, you can read an individual mythos story or an individual Conan story entirely on its own. You don't need to read all of them in order to fully understand all of these stories. Heck, for a long time, the people who held the rights to publishing Conan adventures after Howard's death completely removed all references to the Cthulhu mythos. Because, well, it's kind of a long and complicated story as to why, but basically, the fact that they could be removed and the story could otherwise remain unaffected shows you that even though that continuity was originally there, it's not the sort of thing that could make or break the story, and I think that's the key. You can include all sorts of connective tissue throughout, but if it's the sort of thing that your story hinges on, and removing it requires you to completely rethink everything, or otherwise including it somehow means that you're forcing your audience to experience other stuff they may not even want to experience, that's a problem. That's where a shared universe becomes more of a chore than it does a fun entertainment experience. So like I said earlier, if you want to make a shared universe, that's great, but don't get so caught up in establishing the universe that you forget about your story. Focus on making a good story first, then make it part of a much bigger world. That is the real trick. Pulling that off is the secret to making a truly good shared universe. And in case you're wondering, there are hints and Easter eggs in Operation Red Dragon The Daikaiju Wars Part 1 hinting at other adventures to come, but I'm not going to spoil what they are. You'll find out what they are when the next book comes along. However, I did take care to make sure that those little Easter eggs did not overwhelm the story. Hopefully I was able to do that. Based on the reviews I've seen so far, no one has said there was too much setup with not enough payoff, so maybe I managed to do it. Or maybe just no one thought to look for it. But whatever the case, I did what I could. I tried to follow my own advice. And now, you can take that advice and do with it what you will. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer, signing off. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it, as well as subscribe to the channel for more content of a similar nature. Also, check the description for links to our Twitter, DeviantArt, and Patreon pages, as well as the Amazon link for the novel Operation Red Dragon The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, penned by yours truly. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.